My name is Evelyn Hartman, and I'm 72 years old. Once upon a time, I was a concert pianist who played under the bright lights of New York. For decades, music was my world. But after my husband passed away, I chose quiet over applause, retreating to our house by the sea in Charleston, South Carolina. I thought family gatherings, especially Christmas, would still carry the warmth of belonging. I was wrong. And before I take you into that moment that changed everything, let me say this. If you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or told you didn't belong, then this story is for you. Please subscribe, share, and tell me where you're watching from, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived through this kind of betrayal. The Sterling family's mansion in Savannah, Georgia gleamed with lights strung across the tall oak trees. I arrived with a small tin of gingerbread cookies I'd baked that morning. The scent of cinnamon clung to my coat as I stepped inside, greeted by the clink of champagne glasses and bursts of laughter. I told myself to breathe, to fit in, though I never really had in Vanessa's world. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, swept across the marble floor like she owned every corner of the house, her sequined dress catching the glow of the chandelier. At her side was my son, Michael, his hand tucked into hers, as if they were a royal couple on parade. "Mother?" Michael said softly, almost perfunctory. He kissed my cheek, then pulled back too quickly, as if worried I might leave a smudge on his suit. "Glad you made it." I smiled, ignoring the sting. Traffic from Charleston wasn't too bad. "The house looks beautiful." Vanessa's lips curled into a polite but thin smile. "We do like to keep things elevated. Everyone here tonight is someone important. Politicians, board members, investors." Her gaze dropped to the tin in my hands. "Is that cookies?" "Yes," I said brightly. "My gingerbread recipe, a family tradition." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, Evelyn, how quaint!" Heat rushed to my cheeks. Still, I followed them into the grand ballroom, where guests mingled beneath garlands of holly and a 12-foot Christmas tree dusted in gold. I spotted a senator from Georgia, a venture capitalist Michael admired, even a local TV anchor. Everywhere I turned, strangers in diamonds and tailored suits. I tried to make small talk, but my voice drowned in the orchestra of clinking glasses. A woman in pearls asked if I was part of Vanessa's art foundation. Before I could answer, Vanessa's voice sliced through the chatter. "She's not really involved," Vanessa announced loudly, her champagne flute raised for effect. Well, she's very simple. She prefers her little house by the beach, not exactly our circle." Laughter rippled. My heart slammed against my ribs. Faces turned toward me, curious, amused, some even pitying. Michael's eyes darted to the floor. He didn't say a word. I tried to steady myself. "I was a pianist once," I murmured, forcing a smile. "Music was my life. I suppose simplicity has its own kind of beauty." But Vanessa wasn't done. She leaned closer, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest group to hear. "You know, Evelyn played the piano ages ago, but times change. What we do now requires sophistication. I just worry she doesn't quite fit." Something inside me cracked. I had faced critics before, but never like this, not from family. My chest tightened as humiliation spread through me like wildfire. I wanted to vanish, to let the ground swallow me whole. A man standing nearby tried to change the subject, asking Michael about his latest project. Michael launched into a description of a new investment, seizing the distraction, leaving me stranded in silence. I clutched the tin of cookies like a shield. For a second, I imagined my late husband beside me, his hand firm on my back, whispering, "Play for them, Evelyn. Show them who you are." But he wasn't there. All I had was the echo of his voice and the hollow sting of being dismissed. When the orchestra struck up "O Holy Night," couples swirled onto the dance floor. I lingered by the tree, invisible. My reflection in the ornaments showed a woman far older than she felt inside. A woman treated as if her life's story was already finished. I could have confronted Vanessa right there. I could have told her that I had once performed at Carnegie Hall, that my music had graced concert halls in Paris and Vienna. But the words stuck in my throat. Pride tangled with pain. Instead, I excused myself, muttering something about needing fresh air. Out on the porch, the night was sharp, with December chill. I set the tin of cookies on the railing, unopened. From inside, laughter erupted again. Vanessa's laugh, high and triumphant. Michael's voice mingled with hers, low and compliant. My hands trembled as I buttoned my coat. I felt not like a guest, but like an intruder, trespassing in my own son's life. For the first time, I wondered if family ties were as fragile as the glass ornaments on that tree. Shiny on the surface, one careless move away from shattering. The drive back to Charleston was long and silent. Streetlights blurred through my tears, though I refused to let them fall freely. I told myself I was strong, that I had weathered worse storms on stage and in life. But deep inside, I knew something had shifted forever. I whispered into the dark, as if confessing to the sea itself. If they think I'm too simple, too old, too irrelevant, they'll learn just how wrong they are. The drive back from Savannah blurred into a fog of headlights and empty highways. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway of my Charleston home, the ocean was roaring just beyond the dunes, waves breaking hard against the shore. The house looked the same as always, white shutters, weathered porch railings, the piano waiting in the corner of the living room. But tonight, it felt unbearably hollow. I hung my coat, set down my purse, and let silence close in. For a moment, I thought maybe I should just go to bed and let the humiliation settle like dust. But the sting of Vanessa's laugh still echoed in my ears, and the way Michael's eyes avoided mine carved deeper than any critic's review I'd ever endured. I lit the fire in the hearth, if only to drown out the cold, when the phone rang. It was Margaret, my neighbor and dear friend. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Evelyn, don't you dare sit there alone," she said firmly. "I heard what happened. We're on our way." Within an hour, the quiet house filled with the shuffle of feet, the clatter of dishes, and the hum of familiar voices. Margaret arrived first, carrying a pot of oyster stew. Behind her came Ruth and Clara, old friends from the church choir, their arms loaded with pies and wine. "Oh, sweetheart," Clara murmured, wrapping me in a hug. "You don't deserve a daughter-in-law like that." I tried to brush it off, but the lump in my throat betrayed me. She made me feel like I was an intruder in my own son's life. "Then she's a fool," Margaret said, ladling soup into bowls. "Because anyone with sense knows your worth." We gathered around the worn oak table, steam rising from the stew, the sound of waves faint through the windows. For the first time all night, I felt warmth not just from the fire, but from the simple act of being seen, of being welcomed without condition. Conversation flowed easily, drifting from carols to memories of long-ago concerts. Ruth nudged me gently. "Do you remember when you played Chopin at the Charleston Festival?" Half the crowd was in tears. I laughed softly, surprised at how the memory lifted my chest. "That was a lifetime ago." "It's still you," Margaret countered. "That woman in Savannah doesn't get to erase who you are." As the meal wore on, Margaret's sharp eyes wandered around the room. They landed on the locked cabinet in the corner, the one I rarely touched. "You still keep Harold's collection hidden away, don't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Every painting is still there. He brought them back from Europe decades ago. At the time, they were just passion pieces. Now, I've heard whispers that some of them could fetch millions." The room fell quiet. Ruth nearly dropped her spoon. "Millions?" I lowered my gaze. I never told Michael. I didn't want money to become the only thing he saw in this house. To me, it's still a sanctuary, the place where Harold and I built our life, where music filled every room. But after tonight, I wonder if I've been holding on to an illusion. Margaret reached across the table, her hand covering mine. Listen to me, Evelyn. That house, those paintings, your music, it's yours. You don't owe Michael or Vanessa a thing, not after the way they treated you. Legacy isn't about bloodlines. It's about respect. And he hasn't earned it. Her words cut through me like a blade, sharp but clarifying. I'd always imagined leaving the house to Michael, believing it was the last gift I could give him. But maybe love wasn't supposed to be blind. Maybe protecting what Harold and I built was more important than clinging to a bond already fractured. The fire popped loudly, sending a spark upward, and for the first time that night, something shifted inside me, a flicker of resolve. We lingered over pie until the clock neared midnight, laughter easing the ache of the evening. When the last dish was washed and the front door closed behind them, silence returned. But it no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it carried a strange promise. I stood in the hallway, gazing at the locked cabinet. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. I whispered to Harold, though I knew he couldn't answer. Maybe it's time to stop giving everything away. Maybe it's time I fight for us. For me. The waves crashed louder outside, as if agreeing. And with that, I knew Christmas wasn't over. Something else had just begun. When the last of my friends had gone home and the laughter faded into the night, the house fell still again. Only the ocean remained constant, waves rolling against the shore like a steady heartbeat. I sat at the kitchen table with an empty cup of tea, staring at the cabinet in the corner where Harold's paintings rested, locked away like a secret I'd guarded for decades. Margaret's words replayed in my mind. You don't owe Michael or Vanessa a thing. For years, I'd clung to the idea that leaving the house to Michael was my duty as a mother, the final gesture of love. I thought if I gave him this place, maybe he'd always feel connected to me, to his father, to where he came from. But after Savannah, after the sneer in Vanessa's voice and Michael's silence, I couldn't shake the truth. They didn't see me anymore. Not as a mother, not as a woman, not even as a person worthy of respect. I rose slowly, crossing the room to the cabinet. My hands trembled as I pulled out the key from the drawer. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt louder than the fire crackling in the hearth. Inside, wrapped in old linen, lay Harold's collection. Landscapes, portraits, even an abstract he'd bought on a whim in Paris. I ran my fingers over one canvas, the scent of oil paint faint but familiar, like a whisper from the past. Harold, I murmured, I don't know what you'd think of me now, but I can't let them take this from us. The decision didn't come like a lightning strike. It came slowly, building with every humiliating word I'd swallowed, every time I'd been told to stay quiet, every glance that dismissed me. Tonight, it settled with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. The will would change. Michael would not inherit this house, not the art, not the life Harold and I had built together. I sat at my desk, pulling open the drawer where the will had rested for so long, untouched except for dust. The paper felt heavier than I remembered. The black ink of Michael's name stark against the page. My chest tightened as I read the lines that promised him everything. For a moment, guilt pricked at me. He was still my son. I had held him as a baby, wiped his tears, cheered him through every recital and baseball game. But the man who had stood by Vanessa's side, letting her strip me of dignity in front of strangers, that wasn't the boy I raised. I whispered aloud, as if confessing to the house itself. Love isn't supposed to erase who you are. It's supposed to honor it. With a firm breath, I took a pen and crossed out the line naming Michael's soul heir. The sound of ink scraping against paper was sharp, final. My signature below sealed the moment. My hand trembled, but not from fear. From release, I leaned back in the chair, staring at the amended will. It wasn't about revenge, at least not entirely. It was about reclaiming something I had allowed others to chip away at. My power, my dignity, my right to decide my own legacy. The room seemed different now. The air felt lighter, the shadows less heavy. Even the ocean outside sounded like it was applauding. I folded the will carefully and slid it into the drawer again. My pulse slowed, and for the first time in years, I felt in control. Yet beneath that calm was an ember of defiance. Michael and Vanessa would learn the cost of underestimating me. I turned off the lamp, whispering into the darkness. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. And as the house settled into quiet, I knew I had crossed a line I could never step back from. The morning after I signed my new will, I woke lighter than I had in years. For the first time since Savannah, I felt like I had chosen myself. I brewed coffee, opened the curtains, and let the Atlantic light pour into the kitchen. But peace is fragile. It shattered 3 weeks later with a single phone call. Mrs. Hartman? The voice on the line was careful, too careful. It was Gregory Walters, my longtime lawyer. I think we should meet in person. There are some issues with your will. My chest tightened. Issues? Gregory, I was clear. I amended it myself, signed it. What issues could there be? He hesitated. It's best we talk here. Can you come by my office today? The way his voice quivered made my stomach turn. I agreed, hung up, and sat frozen at the kitchen table. The waves outside pounded harder than usual, as though echoing my dread. Gregory's office sat in a brick building downtown, just off Meeting Street. I'd been there dozens of times before. Harold and I had signed our mortgage documents with Gregory, updated our estate plans when Michael went to college. I'd trusted him for decades. The receptionist, usually cheery, avoided my eyes as she ushered me in. That was my first clue. Gregory stood when I entered, his tie crooked, his hands fidgeting with a stack of papers. Evelyn, he began, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. Please, sit. I sat, folding my hands in my lap. Tell me what's going on. He cleared his throat, riffling through the papers, though he clearly knew exactly what they said. Your son has been proactive. Michael has visited several times these past weeks. He insisted you wanted to make additional adjustments to your estate, claimed you've been forgetful. Forgetful? My voice rose before I could stop it. Gregory, I am 72, not senile. How dare he? There's more. Gregory's face reddened. He provided documents, medical notes suggesting early cognitive decline. I didn't verify them, and that was my mistake. But under pressure, You let him change my will? The words came out like shards of glass. He winced. He told me you wanted it simplified, that Vanessa would manage things better. He said you didn't want to be burdened with decisions anymore. I pushed back from the desk, my chair scraping against the hardwood. So you believed him over me? Over a client you've known half your career? Did you even once think to call me? Gregory's eyes darted to the floor. He was persuasive, and Evelyn, he made threats. He said if I didn't help, he'd report me to the bar for negligence on a previous case. He knew details, things I'd rather not see in the papers. So he blackmailed you. My voice shook with fury. And you folded. He looked up then, guilt etched deep in his face. I thought I was protecting myself, but I failed you. I should never have touched those documents. You have every right to be angry. I rose slowly, my palms flat on the desk. Angry doesn't begin to cover it, Gregory. You betrayed me. My own son might have sharpened the knife, but you're the one who drove it in. For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Then Gregory whispered, "Let me fix this. We can file a correction, restore the amended version you signed. I'll testify if necessary." I shook my head, my voice cold. "I don't trust you anymore. You'll hear from my new counsel." I turned toward the door, but he called after me, desperation cracking his voice. "Evelyn, please, don't ruin me." I paused just long enough to look back. You ruined yourself the moment you chose fear over integrity. Outside, the winter air slapped my face, sharp and clean. I walked quickly to my car, my breath visible in the chill. Sliding behind the wheel, I gripped it tight until my knuckles whitened. My mind spun with images. Michael leaning across Gregory's desk, sliding forged documents across the polished wood, smiling that same half-smile he'd once worn as a boy when he thought he could get away with stealing cookies. But this wasn't cookies. This was my life, my home, Harold's legacy. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away. Rage burned hotter than grief now. If Michael thought he could erase me with paperwork and lies, he was about to discover just how wrong he was. I started the engine, the roar louder than usual, like the car itself shared my fury. As I drove home along the waterfront, the city lights glittered on the harbor, but all I saw was betrayal. By a son I'd given everything to, and a lawyer I had trusted like family. Back in my kitchen, I set the kettle on the stove with shaking hands. Steam hissed as it boiled, and I whispered to myself, to Harold, to anyone who might be listening. They've underestimated me for the last time. The kettle whistled, the waves thundered, and I knew the fight was no longer optional. It was inevitable. I hadn't even finished unpacking my bag from the trip to Gregory's office when the phone rang. My hands were still trembling from the betrayal, and for a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. But the name flashing on the screen made my stomach lurch. Michael. I pressed accept, holding the phone like it might burn me. "Mom?" His voice came through smooth, too measured, the same tone he used when closing a deal. "We need to talk about the house." I let silence hang for a beat, my breath steadying. "I already know what you've done, Michael. You went behind my back. You fed lies to Gregory." On the other end, a sharp exhale. Then, "Look, this doesn't have to be a fight. You're making things harder than they need to be. The house should stay in the family, with me and Vanessa. That's what Dad would have wanted." The mention of Harold's name was a knife to the gut. My voice cracked, but I refused to waver. "Don't you dare use your father's memory to justify stealing from me." His tone hardened. "It's not stealing. It's securing the future. You're 72, Mom. Things happen. You might not always be capable of handling—" "Capable?" I cut him off. "You think because I've got gray hair I'm incompetent? You think playing piano across the world, surviving wars of critics, raising you alone after your father passed? None of that proves I can handle my own life?" The line went quiet, just his breathing. Finally, he snapped, "You're being unreasonable. Vanessa and I have plans for that property." "Do you realize the land alone is worth millions? It could be developed, turned into something profitable, instead of sitting there as your little shrine?" I clutched the phone tighter, fury surging. "It's not a shrine. It's my home. Your father and I built that life together. And you, my own son, would trade it for profit like it was nothing but a pile of bricks?" Michael's voice dropped lower, almost pleading. "It's not about money, Mom. It's about stability. Vanessa knows how to manage assets. She knows how to—" I laughed bitterly. "She knows how to humiliate me in front of her friends. That's what she knows." And you stood there silent. The air between us grew heavier, each second a battlefield. Then his voice shifted, cold and sharp. "If you don't revise the will, I'll take action. I'll go to court. And don't think anyone will believe you over me. I already have documentation about your decline." The audacity knocked the wind out of me. "Documentation?" "You've been forgetful," he said flatly. "You left the stove on last Thanksgiving, remember? You lost your keys twice last month. It's not hard to prove diminished capacity." My heart pounded. Yes, I'd forgotten little things. Who hadn't? But to twist those slips into a weapon. "You're not just trying to take my house, Michael," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You're trying to erase me." "I'm protecting what's ours," he shot back. "And if you force me, I'll drag this through court until I win." I drew in a breath, letting the silence stretch until my words cut clean. "Then I'll see you in court. And until you decide whether you want a mother or just her property, don't call me again." Before he could respond, I hung up. The phone slipped from my hand, landing with a dull thud on the couch. My body trembled, half with rage, half with heartbreak. I stared at the fire flickering in the hearth. The boy I once tucked into bed, the boy who begged me to play Chopin until he fell asleep, that boy was gone. In his place was a man I barely recognized, a man willing to drag me through the mud for money, for Vanessa, for greed. Hot tears pressed at my eyes, but I blinked them back. Crying wouldn't give me strength. Action would. I whispered into the quiet room to Harold, to myself. If he wants a war, then a war he'll get. After slamming the phone down on Michael, I sat for hours by the fire, listening to the logs hiss and crackle. His threat echoed in my head like a storm that wouldn't pass. "I'll take you to court." I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't fight this battle alone. Gregory was compromised. Michael had become ruthless. And Vanessa, well, she'd never seen me as anything more than an inconvenience. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I needed someone new, someone sharp, someone who hadn't already been swallowed by Michael's influence. Charleston's historic district was buzzing with tourists when I parked near a small law office tucked between a coffee shop and an antique bookstore. The polished brass plaque read, "Jonathan Pierce, Attorney at Law." Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and fresh paint. Behind the reception desk, a young man in his early 30s rose to greet me. His suit was simple but well-tailored, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression both alert and warm. "Mrs. Hartman, I'm Jonathan. Please, come in." I studied him as we shook hands. He wasn't what I expected. No gray hair, no practiced air of someone worn down by decades in courtrooms. He was younger than Michael, with eyes that carried the kind of fire I hadn't seen in years. We sat across from each other at a wooden desk, scattered with legal pads and neatly stacked files. He opened a fresh notebook, pen poised. "Tell me everything. Don't leave out a single detail." And I did. I told him about Savannah, about Vanessa's public humiliation, about the will, about Gregory's betrayal. My voice shook at times, but he never interrupted. He scribbled notes quickly, nodding, his jaw tightening whenever I mentioned Michael's tactics. When I finally finished, Jonathan leaned back, tapping the end of his pen against the pad. "Your son forged medical records?" "Yes." My voice was bitter. "He tried to paint me as senile, said I was forgetful." Jonathan's expression darkened. "That's fraud, Mrs. Hartman. If we can prove he tampered with your will, it's not just a civil matter. It could be criminal." "And the lawyer who went along with it?" Gregory could lose his license. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. So, I'm not powerless. He leaned forward, his tone steady. Not at all, but you'll need to be ready. This won't be easy. Michael and Vanessa will fight dirty. They've already shown us that. You'll need every document, every scrap of evidence that proves you're competent and that your will was changed under duress. I swallowed hard. And if Michael drags me through court? Jonathan met my eyes directly. Then we fight him there. You've got more leverage than you think. You're the rightful owner, and the burden of proof falls on him. Besides, his lips curved into a faint smile. I like taking on bullies. Something in his confidence steadied me. I straightened in my chair. Then I'll give you everything. Old letters, medical checkups, proof of the art collection's value, anything you need. Good, Jonathan said, jotting down more notes. And one more thing, stop doubting yourself. The strongest weapon you have is your own testimony. They're trying to erase your voice. Don't let them. The words hit me deep, sharper than I expected. All the humiliation, the doubt, the tears. It felt as though he had named the very thing I'd almost surrendered. My voice. I rose to leave, extending my hand. Thank you, Jonathan, for listening, for believing me. His handshake was firm, unwavering. This is only the beginning, Mrs. Hartman. They have no idea who they're up against. Back in my car, I stared out at the cobblestone street, the distant sound of carriage wheels echoing off old buildings. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel alone. Michael had his allies. Now I had mine. I gripped the steering wheel, a surge of determination rushing through me. If my son wanted war, I was finally ready to fight back. Jonathan's words had steadied me. The strongest weapon you have is your own testimony. Don't let them erase your voice. I carried that sentence in my chest like a shield, but Michael was already planning his next strike, and when it came, it cut deeper than I could have imagined. It started with whispers. At the grocery store, I caught two women near the produce section glancing my way, speaking in hushed tones. One of them, a woman from my church choir, gave me a pitying smile. Evelyn, she said softly, if you ever need someone to drive you to appointments, please ask. We all understand. Appointments? I asked, confused. Her cheeks flushed. Well, I heard from Michael that you've been having memory lapses. Nothing to be ashamed of course. Age comes for all of us. My blood ran cold. I forced a smile, thanked her, and walked away with my basket half empty. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my keys. Michael hadn't just tried to rewrite my will. He was rewriting me. Later that week, it escalated. A neighbor dropped off my mail and lingered on the porch. You left these in your box again, she said kindly. Michael mentioned you've been struggling to keep track of things. Said he was looking into guardianship papers, just in case. Guardianship. The word struck like a hammer. He wanted me declared incompetent, stripped of my rights, reduced to a ward in my own home. That night, I sat by the piano, staring at the ivory keys. My fingers hovered, but didn't press down. Music had always been my refuge, but rage had drowned out melody. My own son was dragging my name through the mud, telling anyone who would listen that I was losing my mind. I called Jonathan the next morning. My voice was brittle, but controlled. He's poisoning the well. People are starting to believe I'm unfit. Jonathan's tone hardened. That's defamation, Evelyn. If he pushes for guardianship, he'll have to present evidence in court, which means we can expose the forged medical reports. But I need you to stay calm. Don't confront him directly. Not yet. I can't just sit here while he dismantles me, I snapped. You won't, Jonathan said. Let me handle the legal side. You focus on being steady. Every calm action you take, every clear word you speak, is proof he's lying. His confidence soothed me for the moment, but the anger still burned hot. The breaking point came when Margaret showed up at my door, her face pale. She carried a folded flyer. Evelyn, she whispered. I found this at the cafe downtown. People are talking. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. My name was there in bold letters. Concern for the well-being of Evelyn Hartman. It claimed I was showing increasing confusion, that my safety was at risk, that my estate needed proper management. At the bottom, Michael's signature. The room spun. My knees nearly buckled, and Margaret caught my arm. He's campaigning against me, I whispered, turning the whole town into his jury. Margaret's eyes blazed. Then you fight louder. You don't let him take your dignity. You have Jonathan now. Use him. That evening, the phone rang again. This time, I answered. Michael, I said flatly. His voice was smooth, almost smug. Mom, I hope you've seen reason. People are starting to notice your decline. It would be easier for everyone if you let me handle things. Decline? My voice trembled, but with fury, not fear. You've turned me into gossip at the market. You've handed out flyers. You've lied about me to my neighbors, all to take what isn't yours. There was a pause, then his tone sharpened. It's not lying if it's true. You can't manage that house forever. Vanessa and I are the future. The longer you resist, the harder you make it on yourself. I steadied my breath. You're right about one thing. This will be hard. But not for me. For you. Because when the truth comes out, Michael, it won't be my reputation ruined. It'll be yours. For once, he didn't have a slick comeback. Only silence. I hung up first. That night, I finally pressed my fingers to the piano keys. A single trembling note rang out. Then another. The melody wasn't beautiful. It was jagged, furious, but it was mine. Michael wanted to silence me, to paint me as broken. Instead, he had awakened something I hadn't felt in years. The fight to be heard. And I was just getting started. The courthouse in Charleston rose like an old sentinel, white columns gleaming against a gray morning sky. My stomach knotted as Jonathan and I climbed the stone steps together. Each footfall felt heavier than the last. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about dignity, reputation, even survival. Inside, the air buzzed with whispers. I spotted familiar faces from town. Neighbors, acquaintances, even members of my church choir. Curious eyes waiting to see if the rumors about my decline were true. I felt like I was walking into a theater where my life was the play and everyone else held the program. Jonathan leaned close. Remember, Evelyn, calm and steady. Let them see the woman you really are. We have the evidence. We'll win this. I nodded, though my pulse raced. Across the aisle, Michael and Vanessa sat stiffly, her manicured hand clutching his. Vanessa's lips curved in that same smug smile she wore at Christmas, as if this entire trial were already in her pocket. The judge, stern and silver-haired, called the court to order. We're here to determine the validity of Mrs. Hartman's amended will and to hear allegations of diminished capacity. Michael's lawyer, a sharp man in a navy suit, was first. He painted me as fragile, confused, unable to manage my estate. Your Honor, he said, gesturing toward me as though I were a relic in a museum. Mrs. Hartman has shown repeated signs of forgetfulness. My client only acted in her best interest. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to shout. Jonathan squeezed my arm gently, reminding me to hold steady. Then it was Jonathan's turn. He rose with calm authority. Your Honor, the claim of diminished capacity is not only false, but deliberately fabricated. We will demonstrate that Mrs. Hartman is of sound mind, and that her son, Michael, manipulated her former attorney into altering her will without consent. The judge's gaze flicked between us. Proceed. The first witness was Gregory. My heart lurched as he walked to the stand. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his guilt had pressed his shoulders down. Jonathan's questions were sharp but fair. Mr. Walters, did you or did you not alter Mrs. Hartman's will without her direct instruction? Gregory's voice shook. I did. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Vanessa stiffened, her nails digging into Michael's arm. Why? Jonathan pressed. Gregory swallowed hard. Michael came to me. He said his mother was declining. He brought what appeared to be medical documentation. He threatened to expose past mistakes in my practice if I didn't comply. I was wrong. I should have verified. But yes, I altered the document under pressure. The judge's eyebrows lifted, eyes narrowing at Michael. The air in the room thickened. Jonathan leaned in. So, to be clear, you knowingly acted on fraudulent information and now confirm Mrs. Hartman never authorized those changes? Yes. Gregory's voice cracked. She was betrayed. By me and by her son. I closed my eyes, the words hitting like both poison and vindication. Betrayed? Yes. But finally, the truth was spoken aloud. Michael's lawyer scrambled to recover. He shifted the attack, calling me to the stand. My hands trembled as I took the oath and sat, facing the room full of expectant eyes. Mrs. Hartman, the lawyer began smoothly. Is it not true that you forgot to turn off your stove last Thanksgiving? That you've misplaced your keys several times in the past year? A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I drew a slow breath. Yes, I forgot the stove once. Yes, I've misplaced my keys. Tell me, counselor, haven't you? Haven't we all? That's being human. That's not being incompetent. Laughter flickered from the gallery, quickly hushed. The lawyer's jaw tightened. And what about your decision to cut your only son out of your will? Isn't that evidence of irrational behavior? I leaned forward, my voice steady and strong. I changed my will because my son stood by while his wife humiliated me in public, then tried to erase me with lies. That's not irrational. That's self-preservation. For the first time, Michael's face faltered, his practiced mask cracking. Jonathan rose again, holding a manila envelope. Your Honor, with permission, we'd like to submit new evidence. The judge nodded. Jonathan opened the envelope and produced a small recorder. My heart pounded. I hadn't known about this. This, Jonathan said, is an audio recording provided by Mr. Walters, made during a meeting in his office. It captures Michael pressuring him to alter the will. With the court's permission, I'll play it now. The judge gestured for him to proceed. The room hushed as Michael's voice filled the air, unmistakable, sharp, and cold. She doesn't need to know. She forgets everything anyway. Just sign the changes, Gregory. If you don't, I'll make sure the bar knows about your little slip 5 years ago. Gasps erupted. My chest tightened, tears pricking my eyes, not of sadness, but of fierce, righteous relief. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was undeniable, echoing off the courtroom walls. Vanessa's face drained of color. She leaned toward Michael, hissing, "You idiot!" Michael's lawyer stammered, "Your Honor, this recording may not—" The judge cut him off. "It is admissible. Continue, Mr. Pierce." Jonathan straightened. "Your Honor, we also submit a letter written by the late Harold Hartman, discovered among his papers. In it, He explicitly states his wish that the house by the sea remain with Evelyn until her passing, and only then be used according to her discretion. This aligns entirely with Mrs. Hartman's amended will. The judge read silently for a moment, then looked up, his expression grave. This court has heard enough. Michael's lawyer began to rise again, but the judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Sit down. The final minutes felt like eternity. I gripped the edges of my chair, heart pounding, as the judge delivered his decision. Mrs. Hartman is of sound mind. The amended will is valid. The attempts by Michael Hartman to interfere were deceitful and, in this court's view, malicious. The guardianship petition is denied. Furthermore, Mr. Hartman, this court warns you that pursuing such fraudulent claims again may result in criminal charges. Gasps, whispers, a few scattered claps quickly hushed by the bailiff. I exhaled, my whole body trembling. Jonathan's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, steady as stone. Across the aisle, Vanessa yanked her hand from Michael's. His face burned red, jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. But I no longer feared him. When the gavel struck a final time, I rose slowly, standing tall in front of the crowd. For weeks, I had been painted as weak, senile, broken. Now they saw the truth. A woman not erased, not silenced, but stronger than ever. As I walked out of the courtroom, the winter light spilling onto the courthouse steps, Margaret was waiting for me. She rushed forward, wrapping me in her arms. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "No," I murmured, my eyes lifting toward the gray sky, the weight in my chest finally easing. "We did it, and I'm not done yet." Because winning the house was just one battle. Reclaiming myself, that was the war. The day after the ruling, the house felt strangely quiet. I thought triumph would sound different, like laughter echoing through the halls or the triumphant chords of a concerto filling the air. Instead, silence pressed against me from every corner, heavy and suffocating. I made tea, my hands steady for the first time in weeks, and sat by the window overlooking the sea. The waves rolled in, calm and indifferent, as though nothing monumental had happened the day before. The court had restored my will, my reputation, my rights. By every measure, I had won. And yet, my heart felt hollow. Margaret stopped by that afternoon, a casserole dish balanced in her hands. "You did it, Evelyn. You showed them all." She placed the dish on the counter and took my hand, squeezing it. "Everyone at church is talking about how brave you were." I smiled faintly. "Bravery feels awfully lonely afterward." Her eyes softened. "You'll find your footing again. Just give it time." After she left, I wandered through the rooms, touching the walls, the photographs, the piano. The house had been a battleground for weeks, every corner filled with fear and plotting. Now it was mine again, untouched, safe. But the victory came with a price. Michael. The image of his face in court, furious, humiliated, haunted me. My son. My boy who once begged me for bedtime stories and climbed into my lap after nightmares. I had defended myself, yes, but in doing so, I had lost him further than ever. Could there be any bridge left between us? I sat at the piano, my fingers pressing down on the keys gently this time. A soft melody emerged, one Harold used to play, bittersweet and tender. Tears welled in my eyes, spilling down before I could stop them. The phone rang. My chest tightened, half hoping it was Michael. But it was Jonathan. "You did incredible yesterday," he said, his voice warm. "Most people would have buckled under the pressure." "I didn't feel incredible," I admitted. I felt like I was breaking apart. "That's what strength looks like sometimes," he said simply. "Now you need to rest. Don't let them steal your peace anymore." His words were kind, steadying, but when I hung up, the ache still lingered. That night, I stood on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, cold and bright. The ocean roared softly in the background, a lullaby and a warning all at once. I whispered into the dark, to Harold, to myself. "I've won the house, but what have I lost?" The waves didn't answer. They just kept moving, eternal, reminding me that life goes on whether we're ready or not. I turned back inside, the warmth of the fire spilling across the living room. For now, I had my freedom. I had my dignity, but the hollow space where a son's love should have been, that emptiness was louder than victory. And deep down, I knew the battle wasn't over. Not really. The days after the court ruling moved in slow motion. People stopped me in the grocery store, at church, even on the boardwalk, to say how proud they were that I had stood my ground. Their words warmed me, but each compliment landed with a sting, because the person I most wanted to hear it from hadn't spoken a word. Michael. For nearly 2 weeks, there was silence. No calls, no visits, not even an angry message. I told myself it was better that way. That distance was safer. But every night, as I sat at the piano, I felt the absence of his voice like a missing note in a song I couldn't finish. Then came Sunday morning. Margaret insisted I come with her to church, if only to lift my spirits. "You can't hide forever, Evelyn," she said, looping her arm through mine. "The world needs to see you're still standing tall." I hadn't expected to see him there. Michael sitting stiffly in the second pew, Vanessa nowhere in sight. My breath caught, my knees nearly buckling. He looked older than his 44 years, dark circles under his eyes, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. The sermon ended, and as people shuffled to leave, Michael stood. His voice carried through the sanctuary, trembling but loud enough to hush the room. "Before everyone goes, I need to say something." Whispers rose instantly. My heart pounded. He turned to face the congregation, his eyes sweeping over familiar faces before landing squarely on me. "I wronged my mother. I lied about her. I tried to take what wasn't mine. And in doing so, I hurt not only her, but all of you, this community that trusted me." His voice cracked. "I was blinded by greed, by pride. I let someone else's ambitions become my own, and I nearly destroyed the one person who has always loved me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some looked shocked, others nodded knowingly, as if they had suspected all along. I sat frozen, unable to move, my hands gripping the edge of the pew. Michael's eyes shone as he continued. "Mom, I don't deserve forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I couldn't let another day pass without saying this publicly. I'm sorry. I am so sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the air felt still, waiting for my response. I stood slowly, my legs trembling, and the entire congregation turned toward me. My voice wavered but carried. "Michael, words can't erase what you did. They can't undo the betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. But I hear you." My throat tightened. For so long, I thought I'd lost you completely. Maybe I still have. But the fact that you can stand here and admit the truth, that means something. It doesn't heal everything, but it's a start. His face crumpled, relief and sorrow mingling. He nodded once, quickly, as if holding himself together by a thread. Margaret squeezed my arm, whispering, "That took courage. From both of you." Around us, people began to murmur blessings, some even clapping softly. The pastor stepped forward to close the moment with a prayer, but the real weight of it was already set. My son had finally spoken the words I had longed to hear. As I left the church, the winter sun streaming through the stained glass windows. I knew the road ahead would still be rocky. Forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a journey. But for the first time in years, I allowed myself a fragile hope. Perhaps that hollow space inside me wasn't permanent. Perhaps Michael and I could rebuild, not the life we once had, but something new, something honest. After Michael's public apology in church, I expected him to disappear again, swallowed by shame or Vanessa's influence. Instead, 2 days later, there was a knock at my door. I hesitated before opening it, heart pounding. There he stood. No suit, no polished mask. Just jeans, a worn jacket, and a bouquet of daffodils clutched awkwardly in his hands. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. For a long moment, I just stared at him, the years of betrayal and love colliding in my chest. Then I stepped aside. "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Harold and I had shared decades of meals, where Michael once did homework while I quizzed him on spelling words. Now he looked small, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting to the floor. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, twisting his hands. "Start with the truth," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He exhaled shakily. "I was wrong. All of it. The lies, the guardianship petition, even letting Vanessa dictate how I treated you. I thought I was protecting my future, but all I did was destroy my own soul, and I nearly destroyed you with it." I watched him, searching his face for the son I once knew. For the first time in years, I saw not arrogance, but raw, unvarnished remorse. He went on, "I can't just say sorry and expect you to forgive me. So, I want to prove it. I'll help you. With the house, with repairs, with anything you need. I don't care how small. I want to earn back your trust." The words cracked something inside me. Trust couldn't be rebuilt in a single conversation, but his willingness to work, truly work, mattered. "Michael," I said slowly, "this house isn't just wood and bricks. It's your father's legacy. My legacy. For months, you treated it like a prize to be stolen. Do you really understand what it means now?" He lifted his eyes at last. "It means home. Not wealth, not inheritance, just home. And I want to be part of it again, not by owning it, but by being welcomed in it, if you'll let me." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft tick of the kitchen clock. Then I pushed the daffodils closer to the center of the table. "Show me, Michael. Don't just tell me. Show me with your actions." The following week, he did. He showed up with paint and brushes, fixing the shutters Harold had once promised to mend. He helped replace the broken porch rail, hammering carefully as though each nail were an apology. When my old car sputtered one morning, he drove me to the mechanic and paid for the repairs without a word. Neighbors noticed. "Looks like your boy's finally woken up," one said with a smile as we watched Michael sweeping the driveway. At first, I was cautious. I waited for the mask to slip, for the old entitlement to return. But day by day, his effort remained steady. And slowly, the walls around my heart began to crack. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the sea, we sat on the porch together. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Mom, I don't expect things to ever go back to the way they were. But do you think one day you'll forgive me?" I studied him. The man who had broken me. The boy who had once needed me. "Forgiveness isn't a destination, Michael. It's a road. You've taken the first step. Keep walking it." His eyes glistened, and for once, he didn't try to hide it. He simply nodded. That night, as I locked the front door, I felt something unfamiliar stir inside me. Not full reconciliation, not yet, but the faintest glimmer of peace. He was showing me, one act at a time, that perhaps the bond we'd shattered could be rebuilt. Not into what it once was, but into something new, something stronger, because it had been tested by fire. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe in redemption. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air when I opened the front door that Saturday morning. Sunlight poured into the foyer, spilling across the polished hardwood floors Harold and I had walked on for decades. But today, the house didn't just feel like my sanctuary. It felt alive again. A group of volunteers stood on the porch, bundled in jackets, holding boxes of books, easels, and armfuls of flowers. Their chatter mixed with the sound of the ocean waves just beyond the dunes. Margaret, practical as always, marched in first with a clipboard in hand. "Evelyn, everything's on schedule. The sign arrives this afternoon, and I've already confirmed next week's art workshop for the seniors." I laughed softly. "You're running this like a general, Margaret." "Well, someone has to keep things moving. You've got a new legacy to launch," she said, her eyes sparkling with pride. After weeks of soul-searching, I had finally decided what to do with the house. No more courtroom battles, no more fear of it being stolen. This place would no longer be a prize dangled over heirs or enemies. It would be a gift. I had converted it into the Hartman House, a community center for seniors and young artists alike. A place where the lonely could find companionship and the voiceless could share their talents. Michael arrived mid-morning, carrying a stack of folding chairs. He set them down and looked around, his face filled with something I hadn't seen in years: humility. "You've really done it, Mom," he said quietly. "This house feels different now, warmer." I met his gaze. "That's because it's no longer about ownership, Michael. It's about belonging." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to help however I can. Not to prove anything this time, just because I want to be here." For the first time in months, I let myself smile at him without hesitation. The first visitors trickled in around noon. A widow named Clara brought her knitting, eager to join the new craft circle. A teenager from the local high school shyly carried in a canvas, eyes lighting up when we cleared a space by the window for him to paint. Laughter filled the halls, echoing against walls that had once known only silence. At one point, I stood in the doorway, watching Michael help Clara set up her yarn, his large hands fumbling clumsily but patiently with the skeins. I felt tears prick my eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of gratitude. He was showing me, day by day, that redemption was possible. Margaret nudged me. "See? You didn't just save this house, Evelyn. You transformed it." That evening, as the last of the volunteers left, I stepped out onto the porch. The sky blazed in streaks of gold and rose, the Atlantic stretching endlessly before me. Michael lingered beside me, his expression soft. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on me. For letting me find a way back." His voice cracked. "I don't deserve it, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to." I reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't erase betrayal overnight, Michael. But today was a good start." He nodded, eyes shining in the fading light. Later, when the house was quiet again, I sat by the piano. My fingers traced the keys, and a melody rose into the night. One Harold used to play, sweet and steady. Only this time, it didn't sound like longing. It sounded like hope. The Hartman house wasn't just mine anymore. It was a legacy. One built from pain, but reborn into purpose. And in that moment, surrounded by memories and new beginnings, I knew that my life, at 74, was not winding down. It was only shifting into something greater. As I sit here tonight, watching the last embers in the fireplace glow, I realize this journey has taught me more than I ever imagined. I learned that family can wound us deeper than strangers ever could, but also that love, even when buried under betrayal, can find its way back through truth and humility. I learned that dignity isn't something others give us. It's something we claim, even if it means standing alone in a courtroom or in the silence of our own home. And most importantly, I discovered that legacy isn't about wealth or inheritance. It's about what we leave behind in the hearts of others. This house could have been just a prize in a bitter family feud. Instead, it's become a place of healing, creation, and belonging. If my story reaches you tonight, I hope it reminds you. You are never too old, too broken, or too dismissed to rise again. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. And sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation. If you felt something in my story, please hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget, leave your own story in the comments. I promise, I'll be listening.